ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for participating at this event.
Recording in progress.
We held this event online for the previous 2 years and had hoped to meet you in person in New York this year. Sadly, logistical challenges stood in the way of that plan. But what's essential is that the event is taking place. This has been an annual event since 2015 and has become a special occasion as one of the biggest annual events for Syria. Therefore, we at Syrian Network for Human Rights and State Department DRL are keen to continue this annual event. Organizing this event wouldn't have been possible without the cooperation of the DRL Bureau. We have worked closely together over the past few months, exchanging over 100 emails. So I want to thank two great women with whom I have worked as a team. Here you only see me, but I wish to thank my two partners behind the scenes, Anna and Sofia. Thank you so much. I would like to thank the sponsoring states, the US, Germany, France, the Netherlands, the UK, and Canada. This event shows the Syrian people that you care about Syria, especially about accountability. A lot of Syrians would love to hear directly from you. They would like to be reassured that your political and legal stances haven't changed regarding the Syrian regime, which has perpetrated heinous crimes against humanity and war crimes against them. I would like to extend my thanks to the International Commission of Inquiry, which published their annual report a few days ago, for participating in this event, and also, of course, to thank Roth, who will share his vast experience with us. Finally, I want to thank and pay tribute to all of our fellow Syrian organizations working for accountability. Thank you to Women Survivors, the Syrian Center for Justice and Accountability, and the Syrian Civil Defense. I now give the floor to our moderator, Emma.
Thank you so much, Fadil, for the introduction and for having me today as your moderator. It's always an honor to be asked to moderate such an important event like this on such an important occasion, as a side event during UNGA. So thank you very much. Thanks to SNHR and to the various states that are co-sponsors of this important event. The United States, the Netherlands, France, Canada, Germany, and the United Kingdom. And thanks to you all for joining us online on Zoom. Please make sure to avail yourselves of the translation function. If you require it, there will be speakers in both English and Arabic. As you will all know, the uprising and resulting war in Syria will soon mark its 12th anniversary. Mercifully, the immediate conflict-related violence has subsided for the last 2.5 years, but it hasn't stopped. The conflict is frozen, but it has not ended. The conflict drivers remain, and some of them have expanded with even sort of worse events and circumstances across the board. More than half the pre-war population is displaced inside and outside of the country. Many are living in dire conditions. They're facing increased pressure to return. Some, as we saw overnight, are losing their lives in the pursuit of safety and some kind of future. Hundreds and thousands of people are dead. And as we saw earlier this year when a video of a massacre in Tadamon was released, and we were reminded on the anniversary of the Daraya massacre that many of those who have died were massacred, and many thousands of others were killed from torture or neglect in Syria's prisons. Over 100,000 people remain missing and accounted for in those prisons. Just a couple of hundred were released earlier this year, and their gaunt, pale faces were testimony to everything that they had experienced and seen. And every day, Syrians are arrested and sent into those same prisons. And this is all because of one man. Assad, or we burn the country, they said. Assad's regime has used his regime against the Syrian people to protect his own power, their own power, and no matter the cost. Today, we're going to hear about the ways that many actors are working to hold Assad and his regime and all of those responsible for war crimes and abuses in Syria and against Syrians accountable for their actions. But accountability doesn't just happen in courts. It happens by acknowledging the problem, like this event house today, It happens by acknowledging the truth, which organizations like SNHR do with their documentation work. And it happens in so many other ways that should ensure that perpetrators do not benefit from their crimes and victims do not continue to pay for their own persecution. And I would invite all speakers today to reflect on accountability in the broadest possible terms. We have 12 speakers today, very fantastic speakers who Fado has already introduced, and I will introduce each again just before they speak. Each has a couple of minutes to make their interventions, and we must stick to time because, as I said, we have 12 speakers. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to our very first speaker. It's my honor to introduce the United States Deputy Assistant Secretary covering Syria, Ethan Goldrich, who will deliver an intervention. It's great to see you again, Ethan. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good day, everybody from New York, where I was at the UN General Assembly, so it's good to be speaking to all of you on the margins of that event. Thanks, Emma, and thank you to Fadil, our co-host from the Syrian Network for Human Rights, for your commitment and leadership on human rights and for participating in this important discussion. I also want to thank the Syrian speakers here today, the UN Commission of Inquiry, and our co-sponsors, Canada, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and the UK for their continued engagement and support on accountability in the Syrian context. Our efforts to promote respect for human rights in Syria and accountability for the Assad regime, regime's atrocities against the Syrian people would not be possible without the human rights defenders, activists, rescue workers, researchers, and partners who have joined us today. Your tireless advocacy has brought much needed attention to the atrocities committed in Syria and the victims of these acts. I want to take a moment to recognize Hala, Hazza, and the family members and friends of victims of human rights abuses and violations who are on today's call, as well as those who were unable to join. For the past 11 years, the Assad regime and its allies have launched a vicious campaign of atrocities against its own population. Some of these rise to the level of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The regime's horrific actions include the use of chemical weapons, extrajudicial killings, arbitrary detention and enforced disappearances, torture, attacks impacting civilians, healthcare facilities, and healthcare workers, arbitrary denial of humanitarian aid, sexual and gender-based violence, and forced displacements. Justice and accountability for these crimes is essential to building the durable peace that Syrians deserve. Without accountability, we risk emboldening others who might be inspired by the success of Assad's impunity. The United States has contributed to these accountability efforts by shedding light on these crimes, sanctioning regime officials for their abuses, and supporting the COL, the IIIM, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and civil society organizations documenting and investigating these crimes. We will not cease these efforts. Justice seeks to end impunity for past crimes and is part of an ecosystem of processes that aim to help a society confront past harm to ensure accountability and foster reconciliation. Accountability in the Syria context not only refers to the use of punitive actions against perpetrators, but also refers to perpetrators taking responsibility for their actions and answering to those harmed. Landmark third country trials under the principle of universal jurisdiction, like the ones we have seen in Germany, France, and Sweden, have served as an important reminder of the meaningful ways in which countries can advance accountability despite persisting challenges. Criminal justice processes, however, are one piece of the broader quest for accountability. Countering impunity, documenting, preserving, and analyzing evidence sanctioning human rights violators and abusers, and clarifying the fate and whereabouts of thousands of missing and arbitrarily detained persons in Syria are other steps that must be taken in parallel. We need to advance these and other efforts to ensure we support the broad array of Syrian people's needs. We look forward to our conversation today and to working closely with Syrians, stakeholders collecting information and evidence, and with all of you to continuing strengthening these efforts and close the accountability gap in Syria. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ethan. We're going to turn now to the Netherlands. The Netherlands, of course, a strong ally of the Syrians' pursuit for accountability. And we're very honored to have today Marcel de Vink, the Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs from the Netherlands, who will deliver the Netherlands intervention. Vice Minister, thank you for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Emma. And it's great to be here. And I'm delivering this also from, like Ethan, from New York. So I need to get out of the event pretty quickly, but I'm really, really glad that I can participate. And I'm glad Guusje Kwartals is already online, so she can step in for the Netherlands as soon as I've left. Let me thank the US first of all for this initiative. We really welcome that. It's incredibly important to continue to focus on accountability and justice when it comes to Syria. I'm glad to see and hear for myself here during the UNGA week that there's a lot of focus on accountability, and I think through this event, there's also a lot of attention, obviously, for what's happening in Ukraine, but also elsewhere. But we must ensure that accountability in Syria remains high on the list, and this is why we welcome this event very, very much. So thanks again to the US for the initiative. Thanks for moderating. Thanks, Fadel, for your co-hosting this event, and it's really important. As I said, it remains crucial to pursue accountability and justice for Syria, and I think that's crucial for our commitment to the international rules-based order. And that is also why we, the Netherlands, together with Canada, have invoked Syria's responsibility for human rights violations under international law, specifically holding Syria responsible and accountable for torture under the UN Convention Against Torture. That's a process we started 2 years ago. It's not an easy process, but we're very determined to continue that, and we'll also keep you updated on where that goes. But we've taken already several steps, and hope to bring this to a good end. We also welcome very much that also national courts are investigating and prosecuting crimes. That's also part of the larger accountability effort. But I'm sure our German colleague will also mention that when he takes the floor. But all our efforts to obtain justice for Syria, they need to have one thing in common, and that is that it needs to reflect the will and voices of the victims and survivors, because justice in isolation from those who have been harmed and wronged will lose its meaning. It is about them, so anything about them without them can never be truly for them. And I think that's important to keep in mind. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is that, and I already said that, I think all the work on accountability and justice requires stamina, it requires endurance, and our commitment, and we need to be in there for the long haul. And we have to work together, and that's why this is a great group. I'm glad you bring us together again, because we need partners and friends to further the cause, and we need to work with partners like the Syria Network for Human Rights. We also need to work with the institutions that we have established, like the IIIM. I think that's really crucial. Ethan already mentioned that. And this, the mechanism has proven to be a unique international criminal justice entity to ensure that the crimes committed in Syria will not be forgotten. And the collection, consolidation, preservation, analysis of evidence are all indispensable and indispensable steps in the fight against impunity. And the work of the IIIM is crucial in supporting the accountability efforts, not just at the international level, but also at the regional and national level, as is the work of all the work of countries and organizations present in this meeting. And so many others that are working for accountability and justice inside and outside of Syria. And thank you again for working on this. We will continue to remain committed, and I think the multilateral efforts need to be continued. We will do that, and we need to look at our national toolboxes, and continuous action is needed to ensure that the international community remains as effective as possible. So thanks again. The Netherlands remains glad to be part of this, and the wheels of justice will turn slowly, but grind exceedingly fine. So let's keep up the good work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vice Minister, and thank you for making the time. I think obviously sending someone to participate in this event of your level really shows the importance of this issue, both to the Netherlands, and I think that will be appreciated by those watching at home. We're going to continue our journey around Europe now. We're very happy to have Brigitte Curmi, the French Syria Special Envoy, to deliver France's intervention. Brigitte, thank you so much for being here today, and I will turn the floor to you now.
Thank you very much, Emma. Distinguished participant and guest, I'm not in New York, unfortunately, so I will deliver my speech from Paris. Let me first of all thank our friend from the State Department and the Syrian Network for Human Rights for hosting this event that we are happy and honored to co-sponsor. The event is named Closing the Gap, the Pursuit of Accountability in Syria. More than a decade after the start of the Syrian revolution, we cannot but acknowledge that the gap between the mass atrocities committed in Syria and the accountability of the perpetrators of those crimes remain huge. Worse, it appears that this gap is widening by the day. As the last report of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry reminded us last week, arbitrary detention and torture remain systematic in regime-controlled areas, and Syria is still not a safe place to return. There are several ways to ensure accountability for these crimes, some of which may amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. France is firmly determined to explore all of them, and I will now give you a brief insight in our commitment. First, we strongly support the work of the Commission of Inquiry as well as the international independent and impartial mechanism already mentioned. Documenting the crimes perpetrated in Syria is absolutely essential to help investigating and prosecuting them. Last July, my country completed the last legislative step in order to approve the International Judicial Cooperation Convention between our government and the IIIM. We also welcome the recent report of the Secretary General of the UN on how to bolster efforts to clarify fate and whereabouts of missing people in Syria. Second, we support the work of national courts who are mobilized in this field, just such as the Koblenz Tribunal, which issued this historic judgment last January. Judicial proceedings are also underway in France. We are following two developments that could lift the obstacles for full application of the principle of universal jurisdiction. One, a bill aimed at removing this obstacle in French law, and a new upcoming decision of our Supreme Court concerning the principle of double criminal liability. Last month, the Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs submitted to the French judiciary hundreds of photos and videos that we have received and that provide evidence of atrocities committed by pro-regime forces during the 2013 Tadammun massacre in Damascus. The alleged actions are likely to constitute the most serious international crimes, specifically crimes against humanity and war crimes. Third, we are dedicated to condemn the Syrian regime's use of chemical weapons against its population. That's why we supported the decision of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons Conference of the state parties to suspend Syria's rights and privileges under the CWC a year ago. We launched and share the International Partnership Against Impunity for the Use of Chemical Weapons, which today brings together 40 states and the European Union. We will follow very closely the next report of the investigation and identification team of the OPCW on the Douma attack. The fight against impunity is a matter of justice for the victims. It is also an essential prerequisite for building a lasting peace in Syria, along with the political solution in line with the UN Security Council Resolution 2254. There will be no peace without justice. Dear colleague, our pursuit for accountability goes way beyond Syria. The recent crimes committed in Ukraine by Russia, using the same methods, if I may say so, it used with the regime in Syria, remind us of the absolute moral and political imperative to fight against impunity wherever and always when it is necessary. The future of a rules-based international order is at stake. Let me finish by commending the heroic efforts of human rights defenders and NGO personnel, many of whom are present today with us. They risk their lives daily to bring the light and the truth against the crimes committed in Syria. It is our shared responsibility to make sure that these efforts are not in vain and that Syrian people's aspiration for freedom, dignity, and for justice are met. Thank you very much.
Really strong words there. Thank you so much for being with us today and for your intervention. We're going to journey back across the Atlantic now to Canada, where Jess Dutton, who is the Director General of Global Affairs in the Middle East Bureau, will deliver an intervention on behalf of Canada. Thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I too am not in New York, but I'm joining you from a chilly fall day here in Ottawa. And I would like to thank the organizers and all the participants for organizing and participating in this really important discussion. Usually I would start interventions like these by saying how pleased I am to be here, but I'm not actually pleased to be here. And I don't mean I know that doesn't sound quite right, but the tragedy and the conflict in Syria has gone for far, far, far too long. The suffering continues, and this is truly a global tragedy. This is very, very important work, and now is not the time to relent. In fact, our work is more important today than it has ever been. I'm very much grateful for the work of participants in this panel, the Syrians participating today, and many others who strive for accountability. I admire the work of our Syrian friends as through great difficulty, they try to seek accountability and peace in their country. We must continue to pursue a political settlement to end this devastation. And in doing so, we must keep in mind that a sustainable peace will only be possible if it includes accountability for the terrible injustices inflicted upon Syrians at the hands of the regime. These violations include repeated use of chemical weapons, torture, summary executions, arbitrary detention, and much, much more. A key component of accountability is truth-telling and establishing a historical record about personal and institutional responsibility for mass atrocities. That is why Canada has and will continue to support international efforts to document and investigate these crimes, including, but not limited to, the work of the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism on Syria and the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria. Canada's commitment to accountability and the pursuit of justice for human rights violations was an integral component of our decision in March 2021 to invoke a dispute process, as was mentioned by the Vice Minister of the Netherlands, in partnership with the Netherlands, to hold the Syrian regime accountable for breaches of the UN Convention Against Torture. And as my colleague mentioned, we will continue to keep you updated on our efforts in that regard. We must also remain resolute on accountability for the use of chemical weapons. Canada fully supports the work of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and we stand behind the legitimacy, impartiality, and professionalism of its work. Canada has been providing funding since 2012 to support the destruction of Syria's declared chemical weapons stockpiles and enable the organization's critical verification, fact-finding, and attribution work. We look forward to the OPCW's much anticipated Duma report and must collectively prepare to respond to any disinformation. As time passes, we must ensure our sense of urgency does not fade amidst new burning geopolitical issues and that our commitment to accountability remains strong. I'm looking forward to hearing from Syrian colleagues joining us today about how we as donors can creatively and strategically support accountability measures. Accountability cannot only be driven by mechanisms external to Syria. For Canada, we support groups like the Syrian Legal Development Program to build their own capacity to advocate for accountability and to place women at the center of these efforts. We also support the work of the Syrian Civil Defense and will continue to do so in the years to come. Together, we must work together to continue to condemn ongoing and new human rights violations by the Syrian regime. Because the only way to end the horrific humanitarian disaster in Syria is through a lasting peace. Canada continues to support the inclusive Syrian-led political settlement to the conflict based on the 2015 UNGA Resolution 2254. In particular, Canada is also concerned by any normalization of relations with Syria and Damascus, as they will only help embolden the regime and hamper our efforts towards lasting peace, justice, and accountability. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate your intervention. Our next speaker is relatively new to the file, but is making up for that with refreshing energy and a lot of engagement. So we're really very pleased to have with us from Germany, the Special Envoy, Stefan Schneck. Great to see you again, Stefan. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you very much for initiating this important event. Important, not least as a reminder of how dire the human rights situation in Syria still is, but also as a reminder that for an end for the civil war in Syria and a lasting political solution for all Syrians, accountability is a necessary prerequisite. But this is the sad truth. 11 years into the conflict, not a single perpetrator of the horrible crimes has been brought to justice at international level. Despite all the evidence which is currently at our disposal, despite the infamous video of the Tedemon massacre that only became public earlier this year. Once again, therefore, we call on Russia and China to assume responsibility and stop blocking the referral of the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. Yet, there's also reason for confidence. In the absence of international justice, national jurisdictions have started to fill the gaps. Former officials of the Syrian regime's repression apparatus, members of Daesh and other terrorist groups are standing before courts or have already been sentenced, as it was the case in Germany. On 20th of April this year, the first verdict became irrevocably valid. The small provincial German town of Koblenz became thereby this year, in a way, a symbol of the awakening effectiveness and reality of world law. Prosecutors in Germany and elsewhere continue to bring new cases to courts. And we are intensively working with partners on that, especially with France, in the framework of a joint investigative group. And we furthermore thank full-heartedly the Commission of Inquiry for their support in bringing justice. So, yes, universal jurisdiction can be an effective and proportionate tool for pursuing accountability for the most serious crimes under international law. However, given the sheer scope of human rights violations in Syria, we must continue to press for all tangible ways to hold perpetrators accountable. In this spirit, Germany continues to support all efforts, those of the international, impartial and independent mechanism for Syria, those of the Commission of Inquiry, those of civil society organizations and relatives of the victims, to ensure that those responsible for torture, killing, and all other atrocities in Syria will ultimately face justice. Before I close, allow me to shift the attention to a closely related issue. The recent presentation of the Secretary General's study on a mechanism to clarify the whereabouts of the hundreds of thousands missing and detained. The study has not only given a new dynamic to the discussions both in Geneva and in New York, but more importantly, it has given maybe a bit hope to many Syrians still waiting for information on their loved ones. I know that all too often the wish to know the truth and the quest for accountability are seen as contradictory. However, we are convinced that these two interests can and must go hand in hand. Germany is thus working closely with its international partners with a view to pushing for a strong and viable mechanism that at least gives some certainty to their families. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stefan. I really appreciate you taking the time and being with us today. We're going to pass now to Jonathan Hargreaves, the UK Special Envoy for Syria. Jonathan, handing over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Emma, and thanks to the US and SNHR for convening us in this incredibly important discussion. And it's really great to hear what colleagues have had to say, and I very much want to associate myself with the colleagues of those who have already spoken, because there is a risk of a perception in the globe with so much going on that the war in Syria is in some way over, and of course it's our job to remind people that that is extremely far from true, and that the devastation suffered by millions of Syrians continues. I wanted to highlight in particular today that this suffering is particularly acute for women and girls of Syria. And Syria sadly ranks as the second worst country in the world to be a woman. So this extremely important conversation on justice and accountability also needs to keep women and girls at its centre. Empowering women and girls builds and sustains peace and security and stability at all levels. The whole of society benefits from more gender equality. And as the most recent Commission of Inquiry report highlighted yet again, the scale of gender-related abuses taking place in Syria is appalling, and those who carry out such violence must be held to account. As others have noted, we have seen some success here, and the Koblenz trial highlighted that international justice mechanisms can provide the means to hold perpetrators to account for sexual violence. But of course, justice is far more reaching than criminal trials. We as the international community need to continue to support immediate justice efforts, as well as empowering women and girls and encouraging communities to support survivors of gender-based violence and to value their role in building resilient communities. We must continue to support the humanitarian and women-led civil society organisations working in this area, who work to build resilience and combat gender inequalities. These organisations do incredible work to create safe spaces and ensure women have access to support, be that legal, psychosocial or medical, all critical components to achieving justice in that wider sense. We're gravely concerned by increasing reports in Syria of economic and physical violence, child marriage and honour killings, and we're concerned that this endemic abuse remains shrouded in a culture of silence. I'm proud that the UK continues to support incredible and courageous organisations who seek to address this. As others have mentioned, arbitrary arrests and extortion and torture continue to be tools routinely used by the Syrian regime, and we must continue to push for perpetrators to be held accountable for this kind of activity. The UK was very pleased to read the Secretary General's recent report concerning the mechanism to address the missing, not least because this is yet another issue which disproportionately affects women and girls, vulnerable in their search for their loved ones, at risk of extortion and sexual abuse, and carrying the increasingly heavy burden of providing for the family. Justice for the missing is one step towards justice for the women and girls of Syria, whilst recognising the many other barriers to justice they face in other aspects of their lives, which must be tackled as well. And we look forward to continued engagement with our colleagues in the international community, and particularly those brave Syrian family organisations in tackling this really important issue. I also wanted to pick up on what other colleagues have talked about in terms of the role of Russia in the question of accountability and the actions of Putin and those who prop him up. Justice for people in Ukraine will have similarities with justice for people in Syria. And the crimes committed by Russia and the tactics they use in Ukraine are all too familiar to the people of Syria. And we must continue highlighting the vile and systematic abuses committed by Russia and ensure there's no impunity. And we again call on Russia to stop supporting the Assad regime and shielding its crimes, and instead encourage de-escalation and a political solution for the Syrian people. We'll continue to hold the regime and others who perpetrate human rights abuses to account. The UK is proud of our long-standing support for the Commission inquiry, the IIIM, as others mentioned, and continued support for humanitarian and grassroots organisations such as UNFPA and Lawyers and Doctors for Human Rights, who work tirelessly to assist survivors of torture and sexual violence. We'll continue to use our position as penholder for the Syrian resolution of the Human Rights Council to highlight the gendered nature of abuses taking place, as July's resolution successfully did. And will ensure Syrian voices are present at the UK's Preventing Sexual Violence conference, being held in London in November. And we call on the international community to continue calling out these abuses, to provide a platform for Syrian voices, and ensure there is an approach to any political solution, and all of our international justice efforts which takes gender into account. The people of Syria deserve justice, and gender parity is a necessary component of any true justice. Personally, I continue to be inspired every day by Syrians I meet who have dedicated their lives to bringing this conflict to an end and ensuring justice will one day be achieved. And we will continue to support them along with our international colleagues in that endeavour, and we urge others to do the same. Thank you to all of the co-sponsors and to the SNHR for making this important conversation happen.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. I appreciate that gender perspective, and we're going to hear a little later from women survivors, which I think will be an exceptionally important addition to the conversation. I just want to pause quickly before we move to the speakers, the non-state speakers, shall we call them, and ask a couple of questions from our diplomatic speakers. And I will turn to you, Ethan, first, since you've had the longest break between having given your intervention. And I wanted to ask you how we could strengthen the effectiveness of some of the existing tools that are available to us in holding the Assad regime and other parties to account, specifically sort of how sanctions against the regime can help to promote accountability.
Okay, thanks, Emma. So certainly we regard the sanctions tool as an important one to promoting the accountability and to demonstrating that there are consequences and there is should not be impunity. So we value that our Congress gave us the Caesar Sanctions Act, and we've used other authorities as well recently, including in sanctioning intelligence officers and some people from the Syrian Air Force that were responsible for the chemical weapons attacks. And we'll continue to look at how we can apply sanctions and use sanctions to both bring some accountability for what's been done already and maybe give pause to individuals in Syria or elsewhere that would even think about committing such acts in the future. So that's on the sanctions tools and certainly elsewhere also using our ability to bring the accountability up in the Human Rights Council and in the General Assembly and elsewhere, and also using the OPCW mechanisms to push accountability for the chemical weapons violations. We also support some of the national court efforts that Stefan was talking about by helping the people that are documenting the court cases. So that's another way that we can help. Over.
Fantastic. Thank you for that extra information and clarification around that particular tool and the additional work that you are doing. Stefan, I just wanted to turn to you quickly for a question. You had sort of talked about, the need for people to know about the missing and accountability are both important things that can work alongside each other. But I want to ask, accountability and the political process working alongside each other. Everyone here, I think, is very focused on a political process in line with Security Council Resolution 2254. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about how the pressure of a sustained accountability campaign can impact the participation of the regime and its allies in that really important political process.
Yes, as I said in my intervention, I don't see the contradiction. In the end, we need justice to get a society also peaceful. So to get a real peace, we need this accountability. So of course, the topic is a difficult topic to get into a discussion for a political process. But it's a final end game, and accountability will be part of it, that's for sure.
Thanks so much. I will turn now to the Commission of Inquiry on Syria, move on to this second part of our discussion today in order that we get through everybody by the end of the panel. The Commission of Inquiry have been given some very powerful testimonies in the Human Rights Council over recent days. I would suggest that you go and look for those online after the events. Linnea Arvidsson will deliver an intervention on behalf of the COI. Thank you so much, Linnea. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Emma, and everyone. Thank you so much for inviting the Commission to this. It's a pleasure, but at the same time, as Joe said, not a pleasure to be here. And greetings from the commissioners who yesterday evening briefed the Human Rights Council here in Geneva on our latest report. And for those of you who would not know this, we were established 11 years ago with a mandate to investigate all alleged violations of international human rights law since March 2011 in Syria, and to support efforts to ensure that perpetrators of these violations, including those amounting to crimes against humanity and war crimes, are held accountable. And I wanted to say from the outset that over the years, nearly 10,000 Syrians have provided their testimonies to the Commission, and we are incredibly grateful to them. Because in a conflict characterized from the very beginning of such amounts of disinformation and misinformation, it is really through such primary sources that we have been able to uncover and corroborate violations and abuses. And these witnesses join many Syrians, and many of them are in this meeting, who are engaged in tireless efforts of documenting violations, and sometimes despite great protection risks to themselves and to their families. So we are incredibly grateful for that. And all of this work over the years have made really clear that the warring parties' attempts to resolve this conflict militarily over the past decade have enabled the violation or abuse of nearly every core human right. Parties to the conflict have cumulatively committed almost every crime against humanity listed in the Rome Statute and nearly every war crime applicable in a non-international armed conflict. And we know the result, and you said it, Emma. The UN Human Rights Office this summer estimated that over 300,000 civilians have been killed, half of the pre-war population displaced, and 90% of those remaining currently in the country living in poverty. And impunity for these violations is simply not an option, and our tolerance for such mass atrocity crimes must remain zero. Otherwise, impunity will become contagious, as some previous speakers also said. And in this, we have been very encouraged that despite the lack of ICC jurisdiction over crimes committed in Syria, it has been so encouraging to see the huge creativity with which Syrians have sought other ways to get justice. And we've seen universal jurisdiction being used in new ways and in new places, coupled with efforts to prosecute perpetrators in the countries where they live. We've seen the first-time use of Article 30 of the Convention Against Torture. And all of these initiatives have been spearheaded by innovative Syrians, often refugees actually, and supported by many of those present here. And from the Commission side, we've been very happy to support these efforts. And so far, we have ourselves directly cooperated with over 60 distinct criminal investigations and prosecutions, and with over 30 more jointly with our partners in the IIIM. And these relate to multiple alleged perpetrator groups, including, but not limited to, Syrian military authorities, Syrian authorities operating detention facilities and military hospitals, as well as ISIL and other armed groups. And it's been great to see these efforts starting to bear fruit, even if the main alleged perpetrators remain at large. We've seen the former Syrian intelligence officer found guilty of crimes against humanity in Koblenz, ISIL members convicted for the genocide against Yazidis, and other armed group members similarly convicted for murder and other crimes. And that list of convictions is both growing and widening, which is great. And from the Commission side, we've recommended to states to continue investing in effective legislative, investigative, judicial and prosecutorial infrastructure to make this progress continue. And it was very encouraging to hear Brigitte and others speak of such efforts that are continuing. But in the midst of all this, we cannot forget that violations and abuses documented are still happening now as we speak. And as much as some want to look away, this war very much continues. And while front lines may seem frozen since the pandemic, the war is not. And attacks keep claiming civilian lives and damaging key civilian infrastructure, including food and water resources. And as detailed in the report that we presented yesterday to the Human Rights Council, torture and ill treatment in detention and enforced disappearances remain systematic. Fundamental freedoms, including of movement, expression, association, and assembly, remain heavily restricted. And against this background, the restorative justice measures that Syrians have called for so often cannot be relegated to a second tier of justice. And more must be done to try to give independent monitors like the ICRC access to all detention places without any exception, free the arbitrarily detained, and facilitate practical measures like vital civil documentation such as birth registrations, and try to safeguard the rights to housing, land, and property of those displaced, among other issues. And crucially, I wanted to pick up on the point made forcefully by Stefan. More must be done to clarify the fate and whereabouts of the tens of thousands of Syrians who are still missing or forcibly disappeared. And we know here that the government, and to a lesser extent other parties, are deliberately prolonging the suffering of hundreds of thousands of family members by withholding information on the fate of those disappeared. And we're saying deliberately because all indications point to the fact that the government knows very well where their detainees are and who they are. They do keep effective registers. We know this from defectors, and detainees are routinely transferred from one facility to another without their families ever being informed. And this is a national trauma that must be addressed. And we want to echo the call of the families of those missing for forceful action. And 3 weeks ago, the UN Secretary General presented a report which calls on member states to consider establishing through the General Assembly a new international body to work on this issue. And we feel that the General Assembly now has a chance to act on the Secretary General's recommendation this autumn, and we do hope that it will. And the Commission, we stand ready to help as best as we can in this, together with the IIIM, the ICRC, the ICMP, and other expert entities who have also publicly stated their readiness to engage in this. And happy to answer any questions that you may have on this. And thank you. I hope I didn't overrun my time, Emma. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Linnea, and I think you really covered a lot of additional issues that are coming up for people, as you do in your reports, which again, I recommend people have a look at. We're going to turn to Rad Saleh now, who has to dash off at the top of the hour for some important briefings. Rad is the head of the White Helmets, who I'm sure everyone is familiar with. They do incredible work. They have been through so much. They see so much, and it's going to be super important to hear from Ryan today. So the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for hosting me, and I would like to apologize because of the of some conflicting appointments, but I am here in New York and I'm talking with in other events also about accountability. I would like to thank my friend Fadl for hosting this, and the United States as well as a partner, as well as selecting this headline or this title, which is an accountability and bridging the gap of accountability. So, do we need more documentation? I believe no. We have a lot of Syrians who witnessed hundreds of thousands of crimes and atrocities that have been perpetrated against them. So we are talking about accountability, documentation, and the importance of documentation that we need to work on professionally, impartially. But what we lack today as Syrians is the lack of a mechanism for accountability for the crimes perpetrated in Syria. And what we are afraid in Syria that those they're criminals, they are safe and they are going around in the world with full impunity. For 10 years, there is no accountability, including persons who are responsible for the use of chemical weapons, but there are no genuine and effective accountability mechanisms for Syria. That's why what we are afraid of is that the dictators in the world will feel safe because they have impunity, and we see the crimes that Putin is perpetrating every day, and he's feeling very safe because he knows that he is not going to be held accountable because he sees his smaller version dictator, which is Bashar al-Assad, perpetrating all of these crimes, and nobody is touching him. We have heard a lot of political statements talking about accountability. There are efforts that are exerted, and there is political support for accountability. However, there are no genuine steps or concrete steps for accountability in Syria. I'm afraid that this will be the same fate for the crimes perpetrated in Ukraine as well. I have been demanding in my meetings here in New York with the officials that I have met in the past days and who I'm going to meet with today to have a concrete mechanism that will be adopted by the international community to hold the perpetrators of crimes in Syria accountable, so we can hold the perpetrators of crimes in Ukraine accountable in the future. I am grateful to the United States and the European states, France, Germany, the Netherlands, the UK, Canada, and all the countries that are talking about their moral and political commitment to the principles that they uphold, including holding the perpetrators accountable. But I have a message to deliver to them and to deliver those messages to their bureaucrats who are working on the Syrian issue, because it seems that there are some practical contradiction and that we can discuss. I discussed that with some special envoys or some officials, because there are contradictions between the statements and the measures that are taken by the European Union, for example. In Syria, for example, Bashar al-Assad 2 weeks ago, he was inaugurating a water station that was funded by the European Union. This is contradicting the political position towards Bashar al-Assad. We need to be very careful about early recovery or a humanitarian assistance to be delivered or to be targeting Syrians, not the Syrian regime. That's why the active members of the European Union should deliver a message to their bureaucrats officials to understand this message. I also thank the COI for the report, and I ask them to share that report with the other UN delegates. Why? Because there are other agencies of the United Nations who want to work with the Syrian regime. They want to reintroduce the Syrian regime. For example, yesterday, the humanitarian task force that is working from Geneva delivered a call to adopt the cross-line delivery. And this is a clear call to surround all the Syrians. Everybody knows that Syrians in eastern Ghouta, Zabadani, and Aleppo, they were surrounded by the use of siege, by preventing or depriving them of food and water in 2015, 2016, and 2017. Now they are using the same thing in Al-Rukban IDP camp. Do we need a cross-line delivery? Yes, we need that for Al-Rukban, but not for the north of Syria, because if that is conducted, this means this is a besieging of the Syrians living in the liberated areas or in the north of Syria. So there should we renounce this call, because we don't want to hear about a hunger case in or a famine in Syria in those areas. The cause of the crisis in Syria is the corruption of the management or the administration in Damascus. The regime in Syria is making use of early recovery and the humanitarian delivery. So we need to be very careful in order to ensure that the humanitarian aid that is provided by the international community, with all due thanks to them, that they are targeting those in need and not to deliver to the regime. We are coming to the winter, and in winter we have more humanitarian needs. Once again, thank you very much, and I really apologize from my other colleagues because I spoke in their turn. And once again, I would like to thank SNHR as well as other organizations. And once again, I apologize. I'm leaving immediately after my speech because I'm committed to other meetings here in New York. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and we wish you luck with the rest of your meetings while you're in New York. It seems that Ken Roth didn't end his decades-long career leading Human Rights Watch by taking a rest from the good fight. So he's joining us here today, and we're very glad to have him. Ken is the very recent former executive director of HRW, So Keen, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Emma. And I should say I'm not taking a rest from the fight. I'm just fighting in a different capacity after 3 decades of leading Human Rights Watch. So I'm finding other ways, including joining you on this very important conversation today. Let me just make a few brief points. I mean, first, this may be stating the obvious, but the place where ideally we would be pursuing justice would be the International Criminal Court. But because of the Russian and Chinese vetoes, that's not possible. And so when it comes to criminal prosecution, realistically, the only option before us at the moment is national courts exercising universal jurisdiction. That's why the work of the Commission of Inquiry and the IIIM are so important, because you can just imagine, a local prosecutor, suddenly finds an alleged Syrian perpetrator in the jurisdiction. They don't know anything about Syria. They don't know anything about, putting together a complex case involving, the history of the atrocities of the chain of command. And that's why kind of the evidentiary work, collecting and preserving evidence, and the analytic work of the Commission of Inquiry and the IIIM are so important. And in fact, Syria really has been the trendsetter here. And we've now replicated this strategy in other places, not only Myanmar, but also Ethiopia, Tigray, et cetera. I mean, this is in a sense the way forward to try to improve accountability for these kinds of mass atrocities. Now, what I want to stress, though, is that so far the handful of nonetheless very important cases, such as the Koblenz prosecution, I think for me highlight the need for every nation to re-examine their universal jurisdiction laws, because in far too many countries, including the United States, those laws are limited to situations in which the national of that country is either a perpetrator or a victim. But in fact, in many cases, a perpetrator might just show up in the jurisdiction and otherwise have no real connection to that jurisdiction. If they're responsible for large-scale war crimes, they should still be available for prosecution. So there is a real need to change these universal jurisdiction laws. In particular, I think it's important not to require the suspect to be present. That doesn't mean necessarily in absentia laws or in absentia trials, but it does mean that prosecutors should be able to start targeting people who are not on their soil at the moment. That's kind of the next stage in this accountability effort. This is not going to be done by local prosecutors. It's going to have to be done, at the justice ministry level. But, people like Assad or Putin who have had, command responsibility for these atrocities, they're not going to travel to your jurisdiction. But given that we're not going to be able to get them for the moment through the ICC, the only way to go after these real commanders of these atrocities is by pursuing the top level suspects through universal jurisdiction. Some countries permit that already, but it just hasn't been done as a matter of priority, as a matter of resources. But somebody, and I think this is going to require coordination among governments, should start to make these cases. And this is not an academic exercise because, the right now you can say, oh, Putin's sitting safe in the Kremlin, or, Assad is sitting comfortably in his palace in Damascus. But that's kind of a president for life strategy. Nobody can count on being a president for life. Ask Slobodan Milosevic, Charles Taylor, Omar al-Bashir, Hisan Habre. These were all powerful presidents who thought that they were secure forever and turned out not to be, and ended up facing arrest and prosecution. Now, I want to note that justice is important, not just retrospectively, important as that is as a way of paying respect to the victims and establishing the rule of law, but it's also important prospectively. And I'm thinking now of Idlib province, where still 3 to 4 million civilians are living. Since March 2020, they largely have been spared the almost daily attacks on civilians and civilian institutions like hospitals and schools and marketplaces launched by the Russian and Syrian air forces. Indeed, we've seen Putin replicate this strategy now in Ukraine. So there is a real possibility that this killing would resume, there have been, moments where it seemed like there were civilians targeted, not the large-scale attacks that we saw before March 2020. Justice would help to prevent a recurrence of these war crimes, which I'm afraid remains a real possibility. I also want to note that there is a certain contradiction between our quest for justice and the way that asylum seekers are being treated. Because in too many countries, there is talk of sending back the Syrian refugees. This is actively being pursued in Lebanon and Turkey, and it's even being pursued by European Union members like Denmark. It's important to note that not only has there been no accountability at any senior level for these atrocities, but the atrocities are ongoing. The detention, torture, and execution centers are still operating. Syria is not safe just because the war has stopped in many parts of Syria. So I think we need to sort of align this very appropriate quest for justice with the political effort to get rid of the Syrian refugees to sort of fuel to placate the far right. Final point, there is a fear at the moment that Ukraine is eclipsing Syria. But Ukraine shows us the consequences of impunity. In Syria, Putin and Assad and their commanders essentially ripped up the Geneva Conventions. They returned us to an era of total war where the laws of war designed to spare civilians the hazards of war were jettisoned in favor of targeting civilians, making civilians suffer as much as possible as a primary aim of the war. As we've noted, the authors of these attacks have never been prosecuted. So as a result of that impunity, it is being replicated in Ukraine. So I think this shows us the importance of justice, really, not just for yesterday's victims, but for preventing more victims tomorrow. We need to return to the enforcement of international humanitarian law, and seeing justice done for the atrocities that have so plagued Syria is a critical step in that process. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and great to hear some creative thinking about how we can expand some of the efforts to pursue justice. We're going to hear now an extremely important perspective for all of us on the panel and at home, and that's the voice of those who've been affected by those crimes. Hala Hazza is the Director of Women Survivors, and she's going to give an intervention. Thank you so much for joining us, Hala. The floor is yours.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أول شيء
Hello. First, I would like to thank the hosts or the organizers of this event for giving me this opportunity to speak about my own experience, which is similar to a lot of other Syrians. I was detained by the Syrian regime, and I am here to communicate my voice, my own voice, and the voices of other Syrians who were detained by the Assad regime, and they were not lucky to be released. And I'm saying luck because there is no justice about what is happening in Syria, especially in the detention of the Syrian regime. I am here because we, as survivors, we have their souls, their voices in our minds, and we are repeating them as long as we are living. I am Hala Hazza from Deir ez-Zor. I am talking to you from Turkey after a trip of displacement that I was forced to leave my dreams and my city after a very harsh experience that I am trying to overcome after witnessing a massacre and detention. And as I am writing my speech for you today, I recalled what happened to me. In 2012, Deir ez-Zor, there was a massacre that was called the massacre of Al-Jura and Al-Fasul neighborhoods. The victims were hundreds from my own city or my own neighborhood who were killed or maimed or wounded by the Syrian regime. I saw how the civilians were killed in cold blood with the different weapons, heavy and firearms. And I have seen tens of pictures of women and children who were slain by knives or they were executed. Ladies and gentlemen, after this massacre was happened in 2013, or after 1 year of this massacre, in 2013 in October, I was my home was stormed by the security forces. In the beginning, I thought that it is only to search the house. I tried to ask the members to show me the arrest warrant, but they didn't show me anything, of course. I was taken to the security branch and they said, "Oh, we are only going to ask you some questions." Those few questions took me 7 months and 10 days of my life without any accusation. 60 days were in the military security prison. Then I was put in a cell that is inhumane. I was tortured physically and psychologically, and I was threatened to be raped. They forced me to confess accusations that were delivered to all Syrians, such as uh, funding terrorism and other things, without having any evidence. They beat me with cables, electric cables, with batons, and they kicked and punched me. I would faint after all a session of torture. And what was more painful to me, not the physical pain, but the psychological pain, and making me broken. In one cases of interrogation, one of the members brought a man who was detained, and the officer crushed his head on the ground, on the floor, in order to force me to say what they want. The sound of banging the head of that man on the floor was terrifying for me. With this atrocity, we were only hostages, and the regime is applying his sadism against us one after one without any accountability. After being silent and not saying what they want, they arrested my father and mother and brought them to the branch, and they took me out of my cell and showed me my mother as they are dragging her to one of the cells in order to put pressure on me to confess. My mother was released after 15 days, and they told me that my father was killed under torture because of me. So I had no other choice to other than stamping and signing 7 white pages without knowing what they are going to write on them. And this is the same case for hundreds of Syrians who were tortured to confess things that they have not done that. Other than torture, we had skin diseases, we have other diseases because of the conditions of living in these cells, and we were deprived of any medical or health care. We were insulted, we were harassed, and as we were beaten, I was thinking of my father and mother. They told me that my father was killed in torture, but after I was released from the branch to Adra prison, I knew that he was still alive. When we got into Adra prison, they searched us completely naked there, and they took us the into one of the dormitories, and there I met all of Syria. I have seen people from Deir ez-Zor, from Damascus, from the north and the south, and I met other nationalities as well, from Ethiopia and other places. After they failed to get any of confession from me, they told me that my issue is will be a field military court, which means that I will be taken again to a military field court and nobody will know my fate. I was waiting my death, and I have seen some of my inmates who were facing a lot of problems, skin problems, amnesia, and other problems. I had a sickness which made me faint for 22 days, to be unconscious for 22 days. In the military branch, I have seen bloods in the corridors and in the bathrooms. I went out of the Palestine branch to Adra prison. And as I told you, I'm not telling you the story in chronology, but I'm just remember to tell you what happened in the Palestinian branch. So in Adra prison, I remember I knew that my father was still alive, and after I was released, I had to leave my city to Turkey because I couldn't go back to my house. Ladies and gentlemen, I survived, that's true, but I am not healed. I'm still struggling for my cause because the criminal is still there and it is still practicing their criminality against Syrians. And there are still survivors in the prisons who are still under torture, and we need to get them free. Ladies and gentlemen, detainees, men and women who are behind the bars, they have very harsh health and inhumane conditions. And their families are being used by the regime. And after they are released, they suffer a lot of bad psychological problems. In other areas, in the prisons of Al Jolani and SDF in the north, there are also a lot of problems. So we as survivors and the detainees and all Syrians, we are seeking justice and accountability that is legitimate and that is our right to hold the perpetrators accountable for all the for all the violations that they perpetrated against us, as well as the countries that supported it, like Iran and Russia. There is no justice without there is no justice without applying a political settlement and a transitional justice. And the intervention of Russia in the region led to a lot of spread of Captagon, drugs, and as well as the extreme ideology. Our demands is to release all the detainees and to expose or disclose the fate of all missing persons and disappeared persons. We demand justice, and our struggle will continue. And we will, and this justice can only happen when the international resolutions are implemented, including Geneva Communique, UN Security Council Resolution 2118 and 2254. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry if I took much time. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for your intervention, Hala. I know it's not easy to talk about these things, but I think it's super important that people continue to hear from yourself and from others in your network so that they can understand, the real human impact of some of the things that we are talking about today. We'll pass now to Mohammad Abdullah, whose organization name matches the name of the panel very well, actually. He's the executive director of the Syria Justice and Accountability Center. So I'll hand over to you, Mohammad. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thanks for our host thanks for having me. I'll pick on your comment about justice and accountability, and we have both, because accountability and punitive accountability is not actually justice for families and victims necessarily. This is coming from a former prisoner twice, and from somebody from a family of prisoners as well. I want to maybe go to a different direction in this panel. I want to echo a lot of what Raed As-Saleh said. Unfortunately, he's not here to hear my comments here. But our issue here on the accountability is not necessarily a lack of measures only, which can provide a lot of good ideas here to bridge this gap, but also it's a policy problem. It's a lack of leadership problem. It's a lack of Syria policy for lots of the member states, including those on that panel here, with all due respect. We don't have a solution for Syria. We need a political solution that we have interpretation for it from 2254 that's different from the Syrian government and their allies on their interpretation of the 2254, and we're stuck here, and nobody is willing to put the political capital or the weapons on the table to take an action somewhere. And that's why this stalled for lots of years and continue to stall also longer. And of course, impunity only encouraged Putin to go on Ukraine and repeat the crimes committed in Syria, and Syrian government to go further and further. Here we have a different demand came from the families. I want to thank Hala for her strong statement, but also thanks the charter group who drafted and published the Truth and Justice report, demanding a standalone mechanism to address the issue of missing people in Syria. The report came from the Secretary General last August, late August, proposed an idea for a standalone entity to deal with the issue of missing people. We have not seen any leadership yet from member states or from anyone in the world actually to take up that proposal and move forward with it, not on the level of the General Assembly resolution, not, to my knowledge, a standalone resolution, and not a third committee resolution. And we had a long briefing with a round of member states in the last 2 weeks. A lot of governments and member states echoed a lot all over the time that they want a Syrian-centered approach and a victim-centered approach. Okay, the victims have spoken. They want a prioritizing of the truth about their missing ones and the release of the detainees. And yet nobody is putting a leadership behind that proposal or that demand. There's no eagerness from the international community to proceed with that. And here we want to deviate a little bit from the report to say what the report missed maybe, and it's not detailed there, is the issue of political will. We can create a Geneva-based mechanism like IIIM and the COI, and this is not to undermine their effort, they're doing amazing work, but the issue of missing people and detainees, unless we have access to inside Syria, we will not be able to solve much of the problem in the issue of detainees. And access inside Syria means member state consent and working with Damascus, which is something nobody is willing to touch this taboo. It's problematic. It will acknowledge Assad won the war militarily with Putin. I don't know. Nobody wants to put their political capital behind this. And a lot of member states rather to just repeat rhetoric statements about supporting justice and accountability from far without doing any meaningful leadership on the topic of missings and detainees. One further point here is without, and I want to echo the German, Christopher, the German diplomat about the accountability and missing persons are not necessarily in contradiction, because we can continue to pursue accountability for a lot of other crimes that's not related to detention or crimes committed in detention facilities. And also, if we establish a humanitarian focused mechanism to focus on the missing people in Syria, that mechanism cannot share evidence for accountability reasons, but cannot prevent survivors from going out of the country or documenting with COI, with IIIM, also with the prosecutors in Europe. Two different comments on different tracks. I want to thank Ken for the ideas on the universal jurisdiction. And I want to bring attention to the member states that we still have a lot of lack of commitment and support from a lot of member states, even when there's universal jurisdiction applied and practices in those countries. For example, a lot of diplomats mentioned At-Tadamun massacre. The Tadamun witness family is strangled in a third country, and nobody is giving them visas for resettlement. This is on the record now. This is shameful. Caesar, when he leaked all the pictures, ended up in a very bad situation economically, security-wise. Still one country took him and his family, and he's not doing well in these countries. So support of witnesses, people who has the actual materials of evidence for trials, for war crimes and crimes against humanity is not happening. It's just being, it falls into the cracks. One final comment I want to make here is basically the role of the families and the charter group and the report, the study the Secretary General put forward is just a start. It's not actually a solution. It's just the start of our battle for missing people and for the detainees. And this will not actually be accomplished without a leadership that's actually missing in the conflict in Syria. There's a lot of tools on the toolbox. Goldrich mentioned sanctions here, and my understanding from State Department and from Treasury that sanctions are kind of two categories. We want to punish the ones who committed war crimes and crimes against humanity, but we have set up sanctions, including the Caesar Act, that's designated to be behavioral change sanctions, and we want to leverage those and put them on the table and see how we can, I don't know, pressure, maybe incentivize the Assad regime to work with the UN on the missing persons mechanism, because this is apparently the demand and the priority of the families and of the Syrians. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mohammad. I think some good challenges there within your remarks. Make sure everyone is still listening. Fadl, we will turn to you as the co-host of the event. It's your turn to make some remarks, not just an introduction. Handing the mic over to you now.
I don't think, Emma, that I have that much time. Anyhow, we try our best to give some times to Q&A. I will make very, very brief comments. I believe that the INGA's violations committed by the Syrian regime for almost 12 years up to date, that's many of which amount crimes against humanity and war crimes, that's showing that the regime is undeterred by the current restriction. I mean that all of the current mechanism, including the regime doesn't care about the Commission of Inquiry report, about even higher mechanism like the joint investigation mechanism, which the mechanism established by the UN Security Council Resolution 2235 and this is joint mechanism between the UN and the RBCW, accused the regime of using chemical weapons 3 times. Because there is no build on the result of those mechanisms. That's happened again and again with the IIT, the investigation and identification team of the LBCW, when they issued 2 reports accusing the regime by using chemical weapons, and nothing happened. As Kenneth said, I agree with him, that based on that, the 12 years of impunity, we need that to consider introducing a new mechanism of accountability. What is the mechanism? What is the type? And how much the state, the democratic state, the civilized one, is willing to support this mechanism? This is need maybe a huge conference and need a further discussion. The second point is the regime didn't survive by himself, but by support of the Russia and Iran mainly. And after a few days is the 7th anniversary of the Russian military intervention. The West imposed 0 sanctions against Russia, crimes against humanity and war crimes in Syria. I think that we are paying the price of that huge mistake. The regime is no longer care after September 2015 of any political solution, of any, he get like a huge support in military, and he again seized tremendous lands. I think that the state need to reassure and reject any attempt to rehabilitate the Syrian regime, and to continue supporting the change toward democracy in Syria, and there is no alternative. I stop here and I give you the floor, Emma. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fadl. Unfortunately, we are not really going to have any time for questions. We've got just 2 minutes until the end of the panel, and our esteemed guests are in all around the world, some of whom are at UNGA and have things to run off to. So we will need to wrap up at the end of the half hour. I think I'll just wrap up the comments of others today. You know, Syria remains important. The war is not over. And I think the high-level participation we're seeing today, the sheer number of co-sponsors, and the huge number of attendees, both in the Zoom room and online, shows that you all still place an enormous importance on Syria, on Syrian people, and on this pursuit of accountability. We heard that impunity has led to further crimes in Ukraine from the same actors, and the degradation of international laws and norms, which have huge implications for everybody, both in Syria, in Ukraine, and much further afield. We've heard about so many initiatives, approaches to documentation, to criminal justice and accountability, some options and creative thinking for expanding this, which was refreshing to hear, whether that's through expanded UJ laws in individual states, by expanding scope, or continuing to push and pursue international justice beyond the universal justice, universal jurisdiction. We've heard about other mechanisms to pursue accountability for the use of chemical weapons, to document the crimes, and to find the detained and missing. And we've heard the experiences and the asks of survivors and those most affected as first responders or human rights documenters. Their asks go further than criminal justice. They include the protection of witnesses, of survivors, of refugees, and most importantly, I think, building on that, we have heard about the need for continued support for the long haul of leadership and political will, and most importantly, for the pursuit of a long-term, sustainable, rights-based political settlement that would help to achieve all of these things. And so hopefully with the help of everyone on this call and those listening in who have a role to play in this process, we can continue to work together to achieve all of those things, to think creatively about how we can not only continue to pursue the avenues that we have available, but to expand them and to try to ensure that we do close the gap on accountability for Syrians and to close the gap on ending this terrible conflict that has gone on for far, far too long now. So I would like to thank all of the speakers so much for making the time, for your support, for the organizers, and of course to everybody else who has listened in today. We very much appreciate your attention and your concern for this issue. Thanks everyone, and good afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Recording.